The poorest way to face life is to face it with a sneer. There are many men who feel a kind of twisted pride in cynicism. There are many who confine themselves to criticism of the way others do what they themselves dare not even attempt. There is no more unhealthy being, no man less worthy of respect, than he who either really holds, or feigns to hold, an attitude of sneering disbelief toward all that is great and lofty, whether in achievement or in that noble effort which, even if it fails, comes second to achievement. A cynical habit of thought and speech, a readiness to criticize work which the critic himself never tries to perform, an intellectual aloofness which will not accept contact with life's realities. All these are marks, not as the possessor would feign to think, of superiority, but of weakness. They mark the men unfit to bear their part painfully in the stern strife of living, who seek, in the affectation of contempt for the achievement of others, to hide from others and from themselves their own weaknesses. Their role is easy. There is none easier, save only the role of the man who sneers alike at both criticism and performance. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
As you can see from that epic speech by Teddy Roosevelt, he really did believe very strongly in everything he said in that speech, and that was that really you need to be in the arena to make a difference. He only really respected those who actually would try, whether they would succeed, whether they would win, whether they would fail. He really believed and showed through his entire life, and he wanted the American people to be the same way, that to succeed in this life, you needed to try, and you needed to strive for the best and try to be great. And he tried to do that every single day of his life. And he showed that in everything that he did. So as you can see tonight, we're going to be analyzing a really special person in our history, our 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy, as the American people affectionately knew him. And he has an amazing rise to power, becoming president at 42 years old, still the youngest president in our history. His incredible rise is documented all the way through with many different steps along the way. Incredibly energetic, gregarious character, maybe one of the greatest characters of any political person we've had in our history. Came from a prominent family and yet had a very interesting upbringing. His childhood was marred by lots of illnesses, and he was a very weak child. And so he compensated for that when he got a little bit older. His father put him on a training regimen, and he started lifting weights, and he started doing gymnasium time, and he started boxing. And he started doing a lot of things to compensate for the weakness that he had had in his earlier days as a child. He was so weak and he had such bad asthma that he was unable to attend school like most of the other kids. And so he was actually homeschooled by a private tutor. And of course, his family being wealthy allowed him to do that. But he really did grow up with a lot of things that were working against him. And that later served him well, as he was a persevere kind of person. He would always find ways to get through difficult times and barriers and other problems. And they really came back to bear not only for his own political career, but for the American people and for the United States. So we're going to talk about him tonight, his history, his background. We're going to watch a short video, and then we're going to go through, as always, our favorite part of the program, the 25 little-known facts about Teddy Roosevelt. I think you'll learn a lot of things in those facts that maybe you didn't know about Teddy Roosevelt before. He really was a fascinating, interesting character, and incredible enthusiasm, incredible excitement. Really only lived 60 years on this earth. However, he made use of every single one of the days he was here. And he really made the country better, and he gave us a bravado and a confidence and a swagger as we were entering the 1900s that we really needed at the time. And he helped the United States grow exponentially into the country that it's become today. So let's go ahead and talk about Teddy Roosevelt's background. He was the 26th president of the United States, was a writer, a naturalist, an adventurer, a soldier, and he really achieved many different things, including being an inventor. He expanded the powers of the presidency and of all the federal government in support of the public interest in conflicts between big business and labor. And he steered the nation towards an active role in world politics, particularly in Europe and in Asia. He actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for mediating an end to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. And he secured the route that began construction at the Panama Canal, which was one of his biggest achievements and one he was very proud of. That Panama Canal, of course, took place from 1904 to 1914. It was a 10-year build. In his early years, he was the second of 4 children born into a socially prominent family of Dutch and English ancestry. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a noted businessman and philanthropist, and his mother, Martha Bullock of Georgia, came from a wealthy slave-owning plantation family. In his frail health as a boy, which we mentioned a little bit earlier, Roosevelt was educated by private tutors in his home. From boyhood, he displayed intense, wide-ranging intellectual curiosity. Later on, he went to Harvard College and graduated, where he was elected to Phi Beta in 1880. He then studied briefly at Columbia Law School, but dropped out of law school and soon turned to writing and politics as his career. In 1880, he married Alice Hathaway Lee, who he had actually met at Harvard in his undergraduate studies. And they had one daughter named Alice, who they named after his wife. After his first wife's death in 1886, just 6 years later, he married Edith Kermit Carroll, who was a childhood friend of his, with whom he lived for the rest of his life at Sagamore Hill, an estate near Oyster Bay, Long Island, New York. They actually had 5 children: Theodore Jr., Kermit, Ethel, Archibald, and Quentin. As a child, Roosevelt had suffered from severe asthma, and weak eyesight plagued him throughout his life. By use of a program of physical exertion, he developed a strong physique and lifelong love of vigorous activity. He adopted the strenuous life, as he called it. He actually entitled his 1901 book, The Strenuous Life, and that was his main ideal, both as an outdoorsman and as a politician. He was elected as a Republican to the New York State Assembly at 23 years old. Roosevelt quickly made a name for himself as a foe of corrupt machine politics. In 1884, overcome by grief by the deaths of both his mother and his wife on the same day, he left politics to spend 2 years on his cattle ranch in the Badlands of Dakota, where he became increasingly concerned about environmental damage to the West and wildlife. Nonetheless, he did participate as a delegate to the Republican National Convention in 1884. His attempt to re-enter public life in 1886 was unsuccessful, as he was defeated in his bid to become mayor of New York by only 1 point. Roosevelt remained active in politics after that and again battled corruption as a member of the U.S. Civil Service Commission in 1889 to 95 and as president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. Then he was appointed Assistant Secretary to the Navy by President William McKinley, and he vociferously championed a bigger Navy and agitated for war with Spain. When war was declared in 1898, he organized the first volunteer cavalry known as the Rough Riders, who were sent to fight in Cuba, and he was actually itching to have some combat experience. Roosevelt was a brave and well-publicized military leader of the Rough Riders. The charge of the Rough Riders on foot was to go up Kettle Hill in Cuba during the Battle of Santiago, which made him the biggest ever to come out of the Spanish and American War. So you can see his rise and his fame in the United States really did largely come because of his time with the Rough Riders in Cuba and the Spanish-American War. That's how he got famous, and that was part of his major rise as a political figure. On his return, the Republican bosses in New York tapped Roosevelt to run for governor, despite their doubts about his political loyalty. He was elected in 1898 to New York governor and became an energetic reformer, removing corrupt officials and enacting legislation to regulate corporations and the civil service. His actions irked party so much that they conspired to get rid of him by drafting him for the Republican presidential nomination in 1900, assuming that this would be largely a ceremonial role and would get rid of him from the scene. Elected with McKinley, Roosevelt chafed at his powerless office until September 14, 1901, when McKinley died after being shot by an assassin, and he became president. Although he promised continuity with McKinley's policies, he transformed the public image of the office at once. He renamed the executive mansion the White House and threw open its doors to entertain cowboys and prize fighters, explorers, writers, and artists. He essentially made the White House the people's house. His refusal to shoot a bear cub in 1902 on a hunting trip, because the bear cub had been tied to a tree by his men, inspired a toy maker to name a stuffed bear after him, and the teddy bear fad soon swept the nation. That's how the teddy bear got its name, was from him, Teddy Roosevelt. His young children romped at the White House lawn, and the marriage of his daughter Alice in 1905 to Representative Nicholas Longworth of Ohio became the biggest social event of the decade. From what he called the presidency's bully pulpit, Roosevelt gave speeches aimed at raising public consciousness about the nation's role in world politics, the need to control the trust that dominated the economy, the regulation of the railroads, and the impact of political corruption. He appointed young, college-educated men to administrative positions. But active as he was cautious in his approach to domestic affairs. Roosevelt recognized that he had become president by accident, and he wanted, above all, to be reelected in 1904. Likewise, he was sensitive as he was to popular discontent about the big business and political machines. He knew that conservative Republicans who were bitterly opposed to all reforms controlled both houses of Congress. Roosevelt focused on his activities on foreign affairs and used his executive power to address problems of business and labor and the conservation of natural resources. Above all, Roosevelt relished the power of the office and viewed the presidency as an outlet for his unbounded energy. He was proud and fervent nationalist who willingly bucked the passive Jeffersonian tradition of fearing the rise of a strong chief executive and a powerful government. He said, "I believe in a strong executive. I believe in power," he wrote to British historian Sir George Otto Trevelyan. While president, I have been president, emphatically. I have used every ounce of power there is in the office. I do not believe that any president ever had as thoroughly good a time as I have had, or has ever enjoyed himself so much in this office. And he really did feel that way. Presidency for him was really the dream job, and he utilized every ounce of his energy to make it the best job in the world. The square deal by Theodore Roosevelt was one of his most famous policies. Despite his caution, Roosevelt managed to do enough in his first 3 years in office to build a platform for re-election in his own right. In 1902, he had resurrected the nearly defunct Sherman Antitrust Act by bringing a lawsuit that led to the breakup of the huge railroad conglomerate, the Northern Securities Company. Roosevelt pursued the policy of trust busting by initiating suits against 43 other major corporations during the next 7 years. Early in his term, he also sought the creation of an agency that would have the power to investigate businesses engaged in interstate commerce. The Bureau of Corporations was formally established in 1903 at his urging. In 1902, Roosevelt intervened in the coal strike when it threatened to cut off heating fuel for homes, schools, and hospitals. The president publicly asked representatives of capital and labor to meet in the White House and accept his mediation. He also talked about calling in the army to run the mines, and he got Wall Street investment houses to threaten to withhold credit to the coal companies and dump their stocks. The combination of these pressure tactics worked to end the strike and gain a modest pay hike. This was the first time the president had publicly intervened in a labor dispute, at least implicitly on the side of workers. Roosevelt characterized his actions as striving towards a square deal between capital and labor. And those words became his campaign slogan in the 1904 election, his square deal. Once he won that election, overwhelmingly defeating Democratic contender Alton B. Parker, Roosevelt put teeth into his square deal programs. He pushed Congress to grant powers to the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate interstate railroad rates. The Hepburn Act of 1906 conveyed those powers and created the federal government's first true regulatory agency. Although in 1906, Roosevelt pressed Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug and Meat Inspection Acts, which created agencies to assure protection to consumers. The muckrakers, investigative journalists of the era, had exposed the squalid conditions of food processing industries and plants. Roosevelt's boldest actions came in the area of natural resources. At his urging, Congress created the Forest Service in 1905 to manage government-owned forest reserves, and he appointed a fellow conservationist, Gifford Pinchot, to head the agency. Simultaneously, Roosevelt exercised existing presidential authority to designate public lands as national forests in order to make them off limits to commercial exploration of lumber, minerals, and water power, and also to give them back to the people who could enjoy them. Roosevelt set aside almost 5 times as much land as all of his predecessors combined. 194 million acres were preserved. In commemoration of Roosevelt's dedication to conservation, Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota and Theodore Roosevelt Island in Washington, D.C. were actually named in his honor. In terms of his foreign policy, and he believed that civilized nations had a responsibility for stewardship of barbarous ones. He knew that taking on the Philippine Islands as an American colony after the Spanish-American War had ended America's isolation from international power politics. Every year he asked for bigger appropriations for Army and for Navy. Congress cut back on his requests, but by the end of his presidency, he had built the U.S. Navy into a major force at sea and reorganized the Army along efficient modern lines. Several times during Roosevelt's first years in office, European powers threatened to intervene in Latin America, ostensibly to collect debts owed to them by weak governments there. To meet such threats, he framed a policy statement in 1904, became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It stated that the United States would not only bar outside intervention in Latin American affairs, but would also police the area and guarantee the countries there met their international obligations. In 1905, without congressional approval, Roosevelt forced the Dominican Republic to install an American economic advisor who was in reality the country's financial director. Quoting an African proverb, Roosevelt claimed that the right to conduct foreign policy was to speak softly and carry a big stick, which of course is a famous saying in our politics ever since. Roosevelt resorted to big stick diplomacy most conspicuously in 1903 when he helped Panama to secede from Colombia and gave the United States a canal zone. Construction began at once on the Panama Canal, which Roosevelt visited in 1906, 2 years into construction. He was the first president ever to leave the country while in office in our history. He considered the construction of the canal a symbol of the triumph of American determination and technological know-how, and he considered it his greatest accomplishment as president. As he later boasted in his autobiography, "I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress, not to debate the canal, but to debate me." Other examples of wielding the big stick came in 1906, when Roosevelt occupied, set up a military protectorate in Cuba, and when he put pressure on Canada in a boundary dispute in Alaska. Roosevelt showed the soft-spoken, sophisticated side of his diplomacy in dealing with major powers outside of the Western Hemisphere as well. In Asia, he was alarmed by the Russian expansionism and by rising Japanese power. So in 1904 and 05, he worked to end the Russo-Japanese War by bringing both nations to the Portsmouth Peace Conference in New Hampshire and mediating between them. More than just to bring peace, Roosevelt wanted to construct a balance of power in Asia that might uphold U.S. interests. He diffused a diplomatic quarrel caused by anti-Japanese sentiment in California by arranging the so-called Gentleman's Agreement, which restricted Japanese immigration. In another informal executive agreement, he traded Japan's acceptance of the American position in the Philippines for recognition by the United States of the Japanese conquest of Korea and expansionism into China. Contrary to his bellicose image, Roosevelt privately came to favor withdrawal from the Philippines, judging it to be militarily indefensible, and he renounced any hopes of exerting major power in Asia after that. During his second term, Roosevelt increasingly feared a general European war. He saw British and U.S. interests as nearly identical, and he was strongly inclined to support Britain behind the scenes in diplomatic controversies. In secret instructions to the U.S. envoys in 1906, Roosevelt told them to maintain formal American non-involvement in European affairs, the maintenance of which was to the best interest of the United States, he said. Despite his bow towards non-involvement, Roosevelt had broken with the traditional position of isolation from affairs outside the Western Hemisphere. U.S. representatives had attended a strictly European diplomatic conference, and their actions favored Britain and France over Germany. The end of Roosevelt's presidency was a difficult one, especially after a financial panic in 1907. His already strained relations with Republican conservatives in Congress degenerated into a spiteful stalemate that blocked any further domestic reforms. Establishment of his independent agencies within the executive branch, and his bypassing of Congress and expanded use of executive powers to set aside public lands beyond the reach of the public is why some historians see Roosevelt's presidency the seeds of abuse that flowered in the administrations of later 20th century presidents. Roosevelt's term ended March 1909, just 4 months after his 50th birthday. Immediately upon leaving office, Roosevelt embarked on a 10-month hunting safari in Africa and made a triumphant tour of all Europe. On his return, he became ineluctably drawn into politics again. For a while, he tried not to take sides between progressive Republicans who supported his policies and those backing William Howard Taft. Although Taft was Roosevelt's friend and handpicked successor, he sided with the party and the split in the party. Both policy differences and personal animosity eventually impelled Roosevelt to run against Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912. When that quest failed, he bolted to form the Independent Progressive Party, which he nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. In a letter to political kingmaker Mark Hanna, Roosevelt had once said, "I'm as strong as a bull moose, and you can use me to the limit." In the presidential campaign as a progressive candidate, Roosevelt espoused the new nationalism that would inspire greater government regulation of the economy and promotion of social welfare. Roosevelt spoke both from conviction and in hopes of attracting votes from reform-minded Democrats. This effort failed because Democrats had attractive progressive nominee Woodrow Wilson, who had won the election with an impressive 435 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 88. Roosevelt had been shot in the chest by a fanatic while campaigning in Wisconsin during that campaign, but he quickly recovered. In the meantime, he wrote his autobiography and went on an expedition to the Brazilian jungle where he contracted a near-fatal illness. When World War I broke out in 1914, he became the fierce partisan of the Allied cause. Although he had some slight hope for the 1916 Republican nomination, he was ready to support almost any candidate who opposed Wilson. He abandoned the progressives to support the Republican candidate Charles Evans Hughes, who lost by a narrow margin to Wilson. After the United States entered the war, his anger at Wilson boiled over when his offer to lead the division to France was rejected. His 4 sons served in combat. 2 were wounded, and the youngest, Quentin, was killed when his airplane was shot down out of the sky. By 1918, Roosevelt's support for the war and his harsh attacks on Wilson reconciled Republican conservatives to him, and he was the odds-on favorite for the 1920 nomination. But he died in early January 19, less than 3 months after his 60th birthday. He held about every office you could possibly want to hold: 2 terms in the White House, governor of New York, undersecretary of the Navy, and held a number of other positions, and of course 1 failed attempt to get a 3rd term as the Bull Moose Party. But what an incredible life he led, and what incredible prominence he took the United States to. The amount of power that he brought to the White House and the amount of power he brought to the United States, which was a growing power throughout the world. You can see he really was a fascinating politician, someone who you could really study for a long time and not learn everything about. So let's go ahead and take a look at a video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
Century, this man spoke of strength, of courage and honor, and the entire nation was caught up by his spirit.
The principles for which we stand are the principles of fair play and a square deal for every man and every woman in the United States. I wish to see you boys join the party and act in that party in the same way I'd expect any one of you to act in a football game. In other words, don't flinch, don't foul, and hit the line hard.
He carried a big stick, but he seldom spoke softly. His name, Theodore Roosevelt, and this is his biography. Mike Wallace, this is biography. Our story, Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a dynamic leader. He was the colonel who led the charge up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. He was the president they called the Trust Buster. He was the statesman who told his country to speak softly and carry a big stick. The night he died, a close friend remarked, death had to catch him asleep, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight. That's the kind of man he was. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States. He was a man of boundless energy, of deep conviction. And his personal magnetism was such that a rival politician complained, when he is in the neighborhood, the public can no more turn away than a small boy can turn from a circus parade. To the American people, he was a symbol of strength and vitality. Yet Theodore Roosevelt began life as a weak and sickly child. New York City, 1863. This handsome townhouse is virtually a prison to 5-year-old Teddy Roosevelt. Crippled by asthma, he wistfully admires healthy children, the free, the active, and most of all, the strong. Young Teddy is thrilled by stories of the Civil War raging in the South. To be a soldier, he thinks, is to be a real man. Teddy's mother, a gentle, cultivated woman, adores her delicate son. But Theodore Roosevelt Sr., a prominent lawyer, is determined that his son will not be coddled. You must make your body, he tells Teddy. It is hard drudgery, but I know you will do it. By the time he enters Harvard University to study law, he is a vigorous young man. He has come to love sports and the rugged outdoor life. By Jove, he writes, I enjoy every moment I live. And he especially enjoys the company of Alice Lee, a beautiful Boston debutante. A few months after Teddy's graduation from Harvard, he and Alice are married. And the young couple's future does seem assured. They have social position, and a trust fund brings Teddy a regular income. But 1 year later, he shocks his aristocratic friends and relatives by taking up an ungentlemanly career. Teddy becomes a politician. He is elected as a Republican to the New York State Legislature and astonishes his colleagues by attacking the ruling political machine, Tammany Hall. But then Teddy's mother dies of typhoid fever. And only 4 hours later, his wife dies in childbirth. Teddy seeks escape. He buys a ranch in North Dakota and throws himself into the hard life of a cowhand. Here he goes out of his way to court discomfort and danger. And in time, he realizes a boyhood dream. He becomes a hardened adventurer. He returns east and marries again in 1886. His bride is Edith Carroll, a friend since childhood. Resuming his career in politics, he receives a Washington appointment as Civil Service Commissioner in Washington, D.C. His startling aggressiveness in this minor position makes him the talk of Washington. After a few years, Teddy moves to another job that calls for a crusader. As police commissioner of New York City, he enthusiastically fights corruption, but he's impatient and he wants an even bigger challenge. In 1897, he wins a post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in President McKinley's new administration. Then, February 15th, 1898. Battleship Maine blows up in Havana Harbor, and a wave of indignation against Spain sweeps the nation. McKinley declares war. Teddy seizes the opportunity to become a soldier. He organizes a volunteer regiment, bringing together cowhands and gamblers from the west and polo-playing Harvard boys from the east. They call themselves Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Amateur soldiers, but their enthusiasm runs high. And newly commissioned Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt is the most enthusiastic of all. Teddy slashes through red tape to get his men to Cuba. He's afraid that the war will end before he can see action. Finally, on July 1st, 1898, Teddy gets his chance. At the head of his troops, he leads a charge up San Juan Hill. I waved my hat, he recalled, and up the hill we went. Teddy and his Rough Riders emerge as the most colorful heroes of the war. His fame and popularity catapult him into a race for governor of New York. Teddy, the Rough Rider, is presented to the voters as the man who can clean up the scandal-ridden State House. After a hard campaign, he is elected. He is 42, but still almost boyishly vigorous. Teddy loves his role as head of a bustling, energetic family. He is a wonderful father, warm-hearted and full of fun. He boasts, "I have the happiest home life of any man I have ever known." Here, he can momentarily forget the intrigues of fellow Republicans who are already looking for a way to ease him out of office. For them, he is too much of a rebel. Party bosses make their move at the Republican convention in 1900. They nominate Teddy for an impressive but traditionally powerless position. Against his will, Teddy runs for vice president on the McKinley ticket. The Republicans easily win the election, and Teddy is put away on the back shelf of the vice presidency. One of Teddy's most bitter opponents, political boss Mark Hanna, is worried. Now, he complains, there is only one light between this madman and the White House. 1901. On September 6th, President McKinley attends the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. An assassin strikes. A week later, President William McKinley is dead. Theodore Roosevelt, the man who was made vice president to thwart his political career, now takes over the nation's highest office. At first, Teddy is dazed by his new position. He pledges to go slow and continue McKinley's conservative policies. Some newspapers hail Teddy's apparent change of heart. He is an entirely different man today, one reports hopefully. Then in May of 1902, 147,000 miners strike in eastern Pennsylvania. The mine operators refuse even to negotiate with the workers. They are out to break the union. The strike drags on for 6 months. With winter coming on, schools and hospitals are without heat. The coal shortage creates a national emergency. Teddy forgets his promise of moderation. He shocks the conservatives by threatening to send the army in to operate the mines. And the strike is settled. It is the first time a president has personally interfered to break a deadlock between capital and labor. 1904, an election year and a time of crisis for Teddy Roosevelt. To be re-elected, Teddy must go directly to the people. Teddy makes sure that his message reaches every interested voter. He tours the country, making an exhausting schedule of speeches. The prestige of the United States is a major issue. Americans are proud of their growing strength, but Teddy warns them that the nation is still considered a minor world power. We are a great people, he says, and we must play a great part in the world. All we can decide is whether we shall play it well or ill. But on the eve of election, Teddy feels that he has failed to win popular support. He fears that the public may not be ready for his bold policies. The huge crowds which have turned out to hear his fighting speeches seem more curious than inspired. And Teddy Roosevelt is convinced that the American people will consign him to political oblivion. Washington, D.C., 1905. A large and enthusiastic crowd gathers to cheer Teddy Roosevelt. He has been returned to office by a landslide vote. I had no conception that such a thing was possible, he says. At last, I am no longer a political accident. Full of assurance, Roosevelt throws the nation into the arena of international politics. Teddy boldly offers himself as a mediator in the Russo-Japanese War. Responding to his invitation, diplomats from both countries meet at Portsmouth, New Hampshire in August of 1905. And at this conference, arranged by Roosevelt, they quickly reach agreement. His new administration has its first resounding triumph on the international scene. Now, Teddy decides on a bold move to demonstrate the United States military capability. He orders 16 American warships to circle the globe on what he calls a goodwill cruise. The Great White Fleet visits various major foreign ports and leaves a lasting impression of America's power to dominate the high seas. But the United States has only one fleet and two great coastlines to defend. To ensure the safety of his country, Teddy is determined to realize a dream which has fascinated engineers for centuries. To link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by a canal across the narrow Isthmus of Panama. In the 1880s, a French company had attempted the project, but disease and engineering difficulties brought bankruptcy and total failure. The United States government is now ready to try where the French had failed. But the Latin American nation of Colombia, which controls Panama, will not agree to sell the needed land at a price Teddy Roosevelt considers reasonable. Suddenly, a revolution erupts in Panama City. As the fighting rages, American warships appear off the coast of Panama, and they leave only after the Colombian government has been overthrown. Within 10 days, Teddy has purchased from the new Colombian government a 6-mile wide strip of land, bridging the Isthmus of Panama. Finally, success. The mariner's map of the world is drastically altered. New York is brought 8,000 sea miles closer to San Francisco. The Panama Canal is hailed as a monument to American technical genius and to the determination of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy continues to carry on his unrelenting battle against the trusts. Monopolies in railroads, steel, sugar, and other basic industries have gained colossal economic power, and they are all but free of regulation. Instead, they often control the government. The United States Senate is even called the Millionaires' Club. Teddy's attack on the trusts is direct and powerful. His big stick policy is a combination of public outrage, court rulings, and the president's withering scorn. Court battles drag on for years, but never again will the presidency be subject to the will of the tycoons. At the end of his term in office, Teddy feels bound to honor a long-standing pledge not to run again. He is begged to accept the nomination, but he firmly refuses. Instead, Teddy handpicks his successor, William Howard Taft, who has been Secretary of War in the Roosevelt cabinet. Taft carries the election with ease, but he is considered little more than Teddy Roosevelt's obedient shadow when he takes office. Teddy is determined to leave political worries behind and to relax. So he sails for Africa on an extended safari. For 11 months, Teddy wanders in the wilds, engrossed in nature study and hunting. For long periods, he is content in the African wilderness, facing no diplomatic problem greater than deciding who gets the first shot at a lion. On his way home, Teddy is welcomed in Europe with the dignity and ceremony due the leader of a major nation. To most Europeans, he is still the President of the United States. He is showered with honors. I feel, he says, that if I met another king, I should bite him. In Norway, he accepts the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in ending the Russo-Japanese War. June 10th, 1910, Teddy arrives in New York City. His friends and admirers welcome him home with noisy enthusiasm, but Taft is conspicuously absent. For a time, Teddy rests in seclusion at home at Sagamore Hill. But inevitably, he is drawn back into politics. Taft's enemies come to him from all over the nation. Daily, he hears reports that Taft is becoming a conservative president, but he is not carrying on the Roosevelt tradition. Touring the country, Teddy accuses Taft of being a weak president, of being soft on big business. Soon, it is clear that he and Taft will contend for the nomination in 1912. Taft replies to the challenge. I do not want to fight Teddy Roosevelt, he tells the public, but sometimes a man in a corner fights, and I am going to fight. The 1912 Republican Convention brings the showdown. After a bitter struggle, Taft wins the nomination and the support of conservative Republicans. Teddy walks out, taking the liberal faction with him. In the heat of anger and disappointment, he makes a fateful decision. He will run in the election as an independent. I am as fit as a bull moose, Teddy says early in the campaign, and the bull moose becomes the symbol of his renegade party. Teddy accuses Taft of giving up national sovereignty and of going to any lengths to prevent conflict with other nations. Taft feels he is being accused simply of not being Teddy Roosevelt. And in the end, the only man who benefits by the contest is the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson. The Bull Moose Party is disbanded. Teddy Roosevelt turns back to his private life, tired and embittered by failure. He has always drawn strength from living close to nature, and now he again becomes engrossed in the study of wildlife and conservation. On field trips, he is happy to be left to himself. In 1913, Teddy travels to South America. From Brazilian officials, he hears of an unexplored jungle stream called the River of Doubt. This has the sound of adventure. Despite warnings that this is a venture for younger men, he leads an expedition to chart the desolate territory. Teddy drives himself hard, elated at the prospect of challenging the wilderness once more. Emerges from the jungle exhausted and with a seriously injured leg. I had to go, he sadly explains. It was my last chance to be a boy. 1916, war is raging in Europe. The nation is caught up in a violent controversy. Should the United States aid England or remain neutral as long as possible? President Wilson, re-elected by a slim margin, pleads for the American people to remain impartial. Teddy Roosevelt dives into the controversy. He's convinced that Wilson is making a tragic error. The events soon prove him right. Finally, on April 6, 1917, Wilson has no choice. He signs America's declaration of war. It has come at last. For a year, Teddy has been hammering at American unpreparedness. Now, finally, he can do something. He goes to Wilson and asks for a combat assignment in France. But the president's answer is firm. He will not allow Teddy Roosevelt to fight. Teddy is humiliated and furious. He is convinced that Wilson has turned him down for political reasons. Roosevelt can't stay away from the great adventure for long. He begins his own kind of campaign, a strenuous speaking tour covering the nation in support of the war effort. He's a familiar visitor in the training camps. He loves to spend his time with soldiers, and he's always ready to recall a glorious victory long ago at San Juan Hill. He is deeply proud that his 4 sons are fighting in France. Then, in July 1918, a few months before the end of the war, Teddy's youngest son, Quentin, flies in a sortie over the German lines. His plane does not return, and the next day he is reported killed in action. When the doughboys come home, a pale and shaken Theodore Roosevelt is there to greet them. He composes a moving epitaph for Quentin. Only those are fit to live who do not fear to die. Both life and death, he writes, are part of the same great adventure. Teddy Roosevelt's great adventure is almost over. He spends most of his time at Sagamore Hill. Now the old energy and exuberance have gone. Shortly before the end, he says to his wife, "I wonder if you will ever know how much I love Sagamore Hill." And then, in the early morning of January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt dies in his sleep. Theodore Roosevelt's death brings worldwide expressions of grief. But perhaps his finest epitaph was spoken by a distant relative, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
We know, and the nation knows, yes, the world knows, that Theodore Roosevelt was a great patriot and a great soul.
As you can see there from that video, there's just so many amazing things that happened in his life. Obviously, growing up as a sickly child, having to stay home all the time, not getting to go to school and being like a normal kid. And then his rise all the way up as an intellectual kid into his enrollment at Harvard, graduating with honors at Harvard, and then obviously meeting his future wife, Alice, attending law school for a short time, but then quitting to become a politician at 23 years old. And then his incredible rise from there through all the different things that happened in his life to get him to the governorship of New York, obviously his time as a military leader in Cuba, and then the unlikely rise to the presidency as the Republican Party had actually put him on the ticket as vice president to almost bury his career. And instead, McKinley gets killed several months later, and he ends up filling out the first term and then getting reelected 4 years later. And then all the things he did even after the presidency that had a huge global impact on this country and really all of our allies as well. His involvement in World War I. And then on top of that, all the things he did for the conservation and preservation of all of our lands, all of our national parks, the expansion of all the different industries that he was involved in, his conservation of animal species, his conservationism in general in terms of the environment, And just the bravado and the confidence he gave the country and the way that he led made the United States already on path to become a major international power. Teddy Roosevelt definitely accelerated that in his 8 years in the presidency, as you can see. Led a very distinguished life, although he only lived 60 years. He led those 60 years in a way that he fulfilled much more than most people do in even longer lives than that. So really a fascinating character. Hope you really enjoyed that, and hope you learned to dig a little bit more into Teddy Roosevelt and his life and his accomplishments. There really were numerous that he brought to the United States and to our allies and to the world in general. His speak softly and carry a big stick policy is still pursued today by our strongest presidents. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 25 little known facts about Teddy Roosevelt. Number one, Teddy went from frail kid to warrior. Roosevelt, often called Teddy by his friends, was a frail kid prone to illness, asthma, and lacking physical strength. Despite his modest build, he was an avid outdoors enthusiast and sometimes carried his fascination with wildlife indoors by practicing taxidermy. At 14, his family went on a tour of Egypt, and he traveled with his tools of the trade, including arsenic. As a teen, Roosevelt put his stuffed birds aside and decided to become an aggressive in his physical routine, training in gymnastics and weightlifting. Later, he would practice both boxing and judo. The intense interest he showed in combat sports made him a fitness advocate for the rest of his life. He later became leader of the Rough Riders and became one of the few future U.S. presidents to lead men into battle. He was always an advocate for carry a big stick diplomacy, as we mentioned earlier. You see a picture of him there on the top right when he was 6 years old. And then there's a picture of him in his uniform when he was the leader of the Rough Riders in Cuba. Number two, he was the odd man out at Harvard University. The enthusiastic and boisterous Roosevelt, who began attending Harvard in the fall of 1876, was unlike many of his more subdued peers. When he was in a fervent discussion, he'd strike his hand into his palm to make a point. When he saw a friend, he'd yell at that friend from across the grass. And despite his rough manners, Roosevelt still made plenty of friends through his athletic pursuits such as football and boxing. And he did okay academically too. At the time of his graduation, he was ranked 21st out of 161 students. He continued his gregarious and boisterous ways throughout his political career. You see some great pictures of him there when he arrived at Harvard there on the top left. And then that's a picture of him on the Harvard boxing team with his beard there on the top right. And then, of course, there's the symbol of Harvard, his university undergraduate. Number three, Teddy tried his hand at being a rancher. Roosevelt was often at his most comfortable when he was surrounded by the tropes of the outdoors: cattle, horses, guns, and vast stretches of land. Traveling to the Dakota Territory in 1883 to hunt bison, Roosevelt was intrigued by the idea of operating a cattle ranch there and soon went into business with a $14,000 investment from Sylvain Ferris, the brother of his hunting guide and cattleman Bill Merrifield. That led to a second ranch, which he dubbed Elkhorn. While he enjoyed playing cowboy, complete with buckskin shirt and spurs, overgrazing and bad weather created financial losses for his business. Roosevelt sold his business and ranches by 1898 and moved back east. See some pictures there of him on his horse out in his ranch out in the Dakotas. You can see the uniform that he wore when he was doing his ranching work. Number four, he was an accomplished author. Drawing on his affection for the outdoors, Roosevelt spent considerable time before taking presidential office authoring books with titles like Hunting Trips of a Ranchman and A Primer on the Western Frontier, the 4-volume Winning of the West. The writing was in some measure an escape for Roosevelt, who once retreated to his Dakota Territory ranch in 1884 after his wife Alice and his mother both died on the same day. In his journal entry for that day, he wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." Roosevelt continued writing for the rest of his life, writing a total of 40 books, relying on income from publishing rather than his public office salaries to support himself later in life. And you can see two of the books we mentioned there, The Winning of the West, which was the 4-volume bestseller, and that's volume 1. And then on the top right there, his book called Hunting Trips of a Ranchman. And I've actually paged through quite a few of his books when I went to Barnes & Noble, and they're really fascinating. I'm actually very much looking forward to reading some of them. Number 5, Teddy once chased down boat thieves. In 1886, Roosevelt's moored boat was stolen from his ranch and taken down the Little Missouri River. Calling it a matter of personal honor and feeling the need to pursue criminals in his role as deputy sheriff, Roosevelt gave chase while accompanied by his 2 ranch hands. Trailing armed thieves was dangerous enough, but the frigid late winter weather had turned the river into an icy, treacherous path. Sensing he could be in for a prolonged ride, Roosevelt packed up flour, coffee, and a copy of Anna Karenina for downtime. After 3 days and braving freezing weather, the group crept up on the thieves on the riverbank and apprehended all of them. Fearing that tying them up might cut off their circulation in the cold air, Roosevelt ordered the men to take their boots off. In cactus country, that was as good as a pair of handcuffs. Roosevelt spent the long ride back reading Anna Karenina. And you can see a picture there of what the river looked like and the type of boat that they would ride on that got stolen by the men. And then you see a picture there when they apprehended the 3 men and they had them under security there next to the river. Number 6, Roosevelt was a war hero, and you heard this a little bit in the video. Drawn to public service after dropping out of law school, Roosevelt became president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners in 1895 and assistant secretary of the U.S. Navy in 1897. After the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Roosevelt insisted on serving and eventually became colonel of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry. His Rough Riders were involved in skirmishes, and Roosevelt himself was wounded by shrapnel while advancing on the San Juan River in Cuba. At the Battle of San Juan Hill, he led a charge up the hill with a skeleton crew of men, holding Spanish soldiers at bay and keeping position until they withdrew. Roosevelt's leadership was hailed by many as an exemplar of courage, and reports of his bravery helped win him the seat as governor of New York upon his return. See a picture there of Roosevelt in his Rough Riders outfit, and also a image there of him leading his Rough Riders up the hill in the San Juan Hill battle. Number 7, Teddy Roosevelt is the youngest president in our history. Vice President Roosevelt became president in 1901, immediately following the assassination of sitting President William McKinley. At the age of 42, he was and remains the youngest president in the country's history. John F. Kennedy was 43 when he was sworn in, and Bill Clinton was 46. The inauguration of Theodore Roosevelt as the 26th president of the United States took place on Saturday, September 14, 1901, at the Ansley Wilcox House at 641 Delaware Avenue in Buffalo, New York, following the death of President McKinley earlier that day. You see a picture there of Teddy Roosevelt taking the oath of office in Buffalo. And then you see a picture there when he was 42 years old and he had just become president as the youngest president in our history. And that's one of his first portraits done as president. Number 8, he was a dedicated environmentalist. A lover of outdoors, Roosevelt made protecting the natural wonder of American territory a priority of his. Over his tenure in the White House, he preserved 200 million acres of land for national forests and wildlife refuges. Previous presidents combined had only done a fifth of that. We have become great because of the lavish use of our resources, and we have just the reason to be proud of our growth, he said in 1908. But the time has come to inquire seriously what will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil, and the gas are exhausted, when the soils have been still further impoverished and washed into the streams, polluting the rivers, denuding the fields, and obstructing navigation. So you can see this is really how he felt. He was one of the great first environmentalists of our country, and he felt that we needed to preserve the land and preserve our resources. See a picture of him there out west in one of his adventurers outfits, and then, of course, a picture of the Theodore Roosevelt National Park in the Dakotas. Number 9, he knew how to charm the press to his advantage. More than any other president before him, Roosevelt knew how to enact effective change. get the press and the public opinion on his side. He created a press room at the White House and invited correspondents for informal chats while he got a shave. He was also prone to publicity stunts like riding 98 miles on horseback and field testing a new submarine vessel by diving to the bottom of the Long Island Sound in the sub. You see a picture there of his 98-mile ride on horseback, where he invited not only his protection men, but also some journalists to come along. And also the picture there of the dive he did on the submarine there in the Long Island Sound. Number 10, as a child, Roosevelt witnessed the Abraham Lincoln funeral procession after his assassination. There's a photo of the young Roosevelt perched in a window watching the procession in New York City in April 1865 that surfaced in the 1950s. Theodore Roosevelt, better known as Teddy or TR, was visible in a window with his brother Elliot in a photo that was taken by a photographer at Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession in New York. At the time, 849 Broadway was the home of Roosevelt's father, Cornelius. And you can see the picture there on the left, very small, is Teddy and his brother Elliot watching the procession of Abraham Lincoln after the assassination. Number 11, Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. As president, Roosevelt adopted an aggressive foreign policy, but he also saw America as deserving a role as global peacemaker. In 1906, he convinced Japan and Russia to attend a peace conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to end their conflict. TR was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in Oslo, Norway. Roosevelt also settled the dispute between France and Germany over the division of Morocco. You see a picture there of Roosevelt on the top left in Oslo, Norway, accepting his Nobel Peace Prize award. And you can see the pamphlet from the Treaty of Portsmouth meeting that happened September 5th of 1905 between Russia and Japan, President Roosevelt being the mediator of that conference. Number 12, Teddy was the father of the modern Navy. To say Roosevelt was obsessed with the naval power would be an understatement. As an undergrad at Harvard, Roosevelt's scholarship on the U.S. Navy during the War of 1812 is still cited even today. He also served as the Undersecretary of Navy as the conflict started with Cuba in 1898. And he sent the American Navy on a worldwide tour in 1907 as a show of strength. And then there was his ultimate naval power achievement, the Panama Canal. And you can see on the right there a picture of Roosevelt when he was the Undersecretary of the Navy. He was young and he hadn't ascended to the presidency yet. And then you see a picture of the aircraft carrier in our current modern naval fleet, and that is the USS Teddy Roosevelt, which is one of our aircraft carriers. Number 13, Roosevelt was blind in one eye after a boxing injury in the White House. The president continued with his hobby of boxing well into his presidency. He also sanctioned boxing matches on the South Lawn outside the White House for the entertainment of White House staff. He suffered a detached retina in 1908 and then stopped fighting after that. He lived with blindness in that eye the rest of his life. He switched to jiu-jitsu after he stopped boxing. You see some great pictures there. There's one that's a rendering of a boxing Roosevelt over in a restaurant in Japan. In the middle there is a cartoon of Roosevelt and his different boxing matches he held at the White House, and then also one on the top right of him in boxing training at the White House. Number 14, TR had a beef with the beef industry. Food safety was not of paramount concern to lawmakers in the early part of the 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt was firm in his mission to make sure American beef products were safe to consume for all Americans, and he dispatched investigators to meat packing plants, collecting horror stories of the dirty preparation areas and putrid meat. Despite intense objection from the meat industry, Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act into law in 1906. You see a picture there of a cartoon back then of Roosevelt and his administration taking on the meat industry. And another picture there of Roosevelt with a cow, signifying the cattle industry that he was taking on and cleaning up. Number 15, he helped save the game of American football. Teddy loved football since he had played it at Harvard as a student. In the early 1900s, football was perhaps even more dangerous than it is today, with only loose regulations requiring protective equipment guarding players from serious injury. Roughly 45 players died from 1900 to 1905 from a variety of ailments as a result of collisions from broken necks and broken backs. With public tide turning against the sport, Roosevelt summoned representatives from Yale, Harvard, and other schools in 1905 to discuss new measures that would improve the safety profile of the sport. His concern helped usher in new rules. While the sport wasn't and isn't safe necessarily, it did largely turn around its alarming mortality rate and grew in popularity quickly after that. TR also recommended strongly to allow the forward pass in the game. And that was a big thing he did towards the end of his life. He really felt like American football needed to progress to not just rugby style football, but the ability to do the forward pass, which of course has revolutionized the sport. Number 16, he practically kept a zoo while in office. Roosevelt's White House was no place for anyone skittish of animals. In addition to the numerous dogs, rabbits, and horses he had, the president also kept snakes, flying squirrels, chickens, bears, a lion, a zebra, and what he described as a friendly and affectionate rat. Teddy had all kinds of exotic animals on the White House lawn, some permanent residents and some just visiting from the National Zoo for a period of time. His love of animals and nature was on full display. You can see some of the pictures there on the White House lawn of all the different types of animals he had, both regular and exotic. Must have been quite an interesting scene there at the White House. Number 17, Teddy burned his presidential portrait. Not known as a vain man, Roosevelt was still disappointed in his official presidential portrait. Artist Theobald Chartrand, Roosevelt claimed, had made him look like a mewing cat. Even his children teased him about it. After being displayed in Chartrand's home country of France, the painting returned to the White House a year later, where Roosevelt burned it as one of the final acts in office. And there's not a picture of that portrait here, and the reason was because it got burned and there was no copies made. You can see 3 of the portraits that he actually approved of and liked. One of the ones on the top right there is when he was a younger man, and then 2 of the ones were when he was president in office. So he did find some portraits that he liked, but the one that he did not like, he burned, and unfortunately we don't have a copy of it today. Number 18, he was the first president to leave the country during his term. Roosevelt, who had petitioned for the construction of the Panama Canal for years, couldn't resist an opportunity to see the site for himself when plans were finally underway. In 1906, he visited Panama, and in doing so became the first president to travel outside the U.S. while holding office. The workers let him operate a steam shovel, and you can see a picture there of the finished Panama Canal up in the top right, which happened after his presidency. And then a picture on the bottom left there of him shoveling out the Panama Canal, a cartoon. And then a picture of the meeting he had there at the Panama Canal on a boat. And then, of course, the famous picture of him operating a steam shovel and actually digging out some dirt from the canal itself. Number 19, he went skinny dipping with the French ambassador in the Potomac River. Virtually all of our presidents have retained their modesty, but Roosevelt was never bashful about abandoning his clothes for a quick naked dip in the water. While walking near the Potomac River in 1903, the president and the chief of Division of Forestry, Gifford Pinchot, who we mentioned earlier, jumped in for a swim, leaving their clothes behind. The French ambassador was with them, though he elected to keep his gloves on only because he said, "We might meet ladies." Ironically, Teddy's cousin Franklin D. Roosevelt also loved a skinny dip, as did John F. Kennedy. You see on the top left there a caricature of this swimming event with Teddy Roosevelt. And then on the top picture up there, that's his cousin FDR, who also went skinny dipping. And then, of course, John F. Kennedy on the bottom left. All of them were skinny dippers, ironically. Number 20, he scared Dr. Seuss and was a friend of the Boy Scouts. As a boy, Theodore Geisel, who is Dr. Seuss, who would later be known as Dr. Seuss, sold war bonds in his hometown of Springfield, Massachusetts. As sales leaders in their Boy Scout troop, Geisel and his fellow scouts were honored in 1918 by a visiting Roosevelt, Unfortunately, Roosevelt had only 9 medals for 10 boys. Arriving in front of Geisel empty-handed, he tried to make a joke of it by saying, "What's this boy doing here?" Geisel was so stricken by the booming Roosevelt's accusation that he later declared the incident installed in him a fear of large crowds. Roosevelt spent his retired years trying to bolster and build the importance of scouting in the United States, believing it to be vitally important to the growth of young men. And you can see a picture there on the top right of a young Dr. Seuss or Theodore Geisel, and then a picture there of Geisel with one of his famous characters. And then there's the actual incident on the bottom there where Theodore Roosevelt visited the scout troop, including Dr. Seuss when he was in the Scouts. 21, TR was the first former president to fly in an airplane. Heeding another call to adventure, in 1910, Roosevelt became the first current or former president to board a plane. The opportunity came at the invitation of aviator Arch Hoxsey, who invited Roosevelt to climb on board his plane in St. Louis, Missouri. A crowd of 10,000 people watched, with some of them expecting the beloved public figure to meet a bad end in the suspect-looking craft. After a 3-minute, 20-second flight, Roosevelt was beaming. "I envy you your professional conquest of space," he told Huxley. You see some great pictures there from that day and from that event of Teddy Roosevelt sitting next to the pilot for this 3-minute and 20-second flight. What a cool event. Number 22, TR met Harry Houdini sailing on the SS Imperator in 1914. Roosevelt was captivated by the ship's booked entertainment, famed illusionist Harry Houdini. After a seance in which the magician correctly surmised Roosevelt had been in Brazil recently, an astounded Roosevelt asked if Houdini was really practiced in the dark arts. He played coy, but the truth was Houdini knew Roosevelt would be on board and asked associates for some information about his recent exploits. You see a picture there from that cruise of Roosevelt meeting Houdini for the first time, and then one of Houdini's great stunts that he did where he was plunged into the water all tied up and then came up alive after that event. Number 23, a trip to the Amazon almost killed him. You heard this in the video. An incurable adventurer, Roosevelt set his sights on the Amazon River in 1913, declaring it as his last chance to be a boy, plotting his course on the largely uncharted and inherently dangerous River of Doubt. Roosevelt's notoriously sturdy constitution was challenged like never before. Several people in the party were struck down by tropical illness, and half of the pack animals traveling with them died of exhaustion, and food became scarce. Roosevelt himself grew ill with fever and reportedly was prepared to be left to die. After 2 months, they were able to return to civilization, and he barely survived, taking a month in the hospital to recover. And you see some famous pictures from that excursion he did into the Amazon there in Brazil. Quite amazing he was able to survive that. Some people believe that he died at 60, not too long after that, largely because of the sickness that he had contracted in Brazil, that he would have lived much longer if he had not taken that trip and not gotten that strange illness. 24, he inspired the teddy bear. While on a hunting trip as president, guys in Mississippi had arranged for Roosevelt to shoot an old bear they had tied to a tree. Roosevelt refused to do so on sporting grounds. The first part of the incident became a newspaper cartoon, which then inspired a shopkeeper to sell stuffed bears with Roosevelt's permission. It became more popular and a nationwide sensation, and then within 2 years, the top gift given at Christmas to kids around the country. And you can see a picture of the incident there where he's refusing to shoot the bear because it's tied up. And then one of the ads for the teddy bear, the first teddy bear, with Teddy taking the bear out of a box for the children. And then a magazine that came out called The Teddy Bear Men, which was written by Theodore Roosevelt and Clifford Berryman. It's really interesting that we've come in our society to beloved our teddy bears so much. And of course, it was inspired by Teddy Roosevelt. Number 25, Teddy Roosevelt continued a speech after being shot. And you also heard about this in the video. Roosevelt's reputation was a bull moose. His term to describe anyone made of sturdy stuff was never on better display than October 14th, 1912, when the former president was giving a speech in Milwaukee and it announced he had just been shot by a would-be assassin named John Schrank. A shocked crowd looked on as Roosevelt revealed a bloody shirt and a stack of prepared remarks with a bullet hole in them. Roosevelt spoke for 90 minutes before allowing his aides to take him to the hospital. The bullet had lodged itself near his ribs and would remain there for the rest of his life. So what a close call he had here, and what saved his life was that stack of papers for the speech that the bullet had to hit and then try to go through, and likely saved his life. And you see a newspaper clipping there of the incident that he was shot by a maniac and that he was able to survive. Some famous Teddy Roosevelt quotes. First one here is, "I have never in my life envied a human being who led an easy life. I have envied a great many people who led difficult lives and led them well." So that shows the constitution of Theodore Roosevelt and how he really felt. He admired people that went the difficult way and worked hard and gave effort. Another quote here, "Believe you can and you're halfway there." And that really is true. He was an optimist. And the way he looked at things is, if you believe you can do it, you can do it. Another one here, "With self-discipline, most anything is possible." Another one is, "Patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president." And what was interesting is he actually said that while he was president. So he believed very strongly that don't just agree with me because you think it's patriotic to agree with me because you believe in the policy. It's more important to stand by the country than the president. "Nobody cares how much you will know until they know how much you care." And that's a really important principle he believed in, that as soon as he was able to communicate to the people how much he cared, then they would listen to him and listen to his policies. "Do what you can with all you have, wherever you are." His most famous quote, of course, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And this was a saying that's been taken by several modern presidents, including Ronald Reagan, who often used this Theodore Roosevelt saying in his speeches to talk about his approach to foreign policy as well. You can see a picture on the bottom there of the statue there in South Dakota with Theodore Roosevelt on it. "This country will not be a good place for any of us to live in unless we make it a good place for all of us to live in." Teddy Roosevelt. And you can see what an incredible thing that he was offered, one of 4 presidents, to be on that incredible shrine in South Dakota. And then final quote here is, "The only man who never makes mistakes is the man who never does anything." And again, this is very much what he believed, is that to really accomplish big things, you need to jump into the arena. And we talked about that at the beginning of the program, that his "in the arena" speech was so important to him and to his philosophy. So I hope you enjoyed that and that you learned a lot about Teddy Roosevelt, one of our great presidents, one of our most consequential presidents, one who had a tremendous impact and still does today. There are many people that are still learning from both his domestic and his foreign policy, and also his conservation ways, his belief in federal government's ability to regulate, but not too much, but to do enough to secure the people and to secure industries for all of us. And so he really did believe that. I would say he was more of a pragmatist politician, not a pure Republican, not a pure Democrat. He was somewhere in the middle, and he was very much a pragmatist when it came to his policies. Hopefully you will learn to want to dig into Teddy Roosevelt a little bit more, learn more about this great man, this great American and patriot. And as you saw with the 25 little known facts, there's so many things to learn about him that you never would have known before. Such an interesting character and incredible gregarious spirit in our history. So thank you very much for joining this evening, and hope to see you again on another episode of Traveling Through History very soon. Have a great night.
On every sea, met every king and potentate, including old Johnny. In every corner of the earth, they don't think it was fame, but there's a ruler greater still, no doubt you've heard his name.